Okay. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to our October City Law Breakfast. I'm Ross Sandler, Director of the Center for New York City Law, and delighted to welcome you all to this breakfast this morning. These breakfasts are supported by Con Edison, Verizon, the law firm of Greenberg Traurig, and the Murray Goodgold Foundation, and we thank them for their support, which allows us to have the breakfast and to keep them without charge. The next breakfast will take place not on a Friday, but on a Tuesday, November 22nd, when Sheldon Silver will be here, and I invite you to that breakfast in November. We are delighted to have Adrian Benepe here today, Commissioner of New York City Parks and Recreation. One of the most important jobs in the city. As Henry Stern, who is here, used to say, the Parks Department controls more land in the city than any other agency, and it is the biggest landlord. Adrian Benepe's work in the Department of Parks began early on. In 1979, he was among those who were first in the Urban Parks Rangers. He rose in the department to handle very important responsibilities involving the wetlands and forests and the art and antiquities. He left the Parks Department in the 1990s, but came back under Commissioner Stern, and Commissioner Stern's return as Manhattan Borough Commissioner. And then in 2002 was appointed commissioner. His work has been outstanding in the Parks Department throughout, and in some ways it reflects not only on him but his family. Those of you who know about Barry Benepe, his father, who really is who was the creator of the green markets, beginning in 1976. And in keeping with the tradition of making New York City far more beautiful and livable and bringing a high quality of life for all of us, Adrian Benepe is doing that now as Commissioner of Parks, and we welcome him here to New York Law School.
Well, thank you very much, Ross. Of course, Ross was a colleague in city government before he came here, and it's great to see other colleagues of his and of mine in city government, including Henry Stern, the Parks Commissioner who served under two mayors, and will always, I think, have the distinction of being the second longest serving Parks Commissioner after Robert Moses. It's a mark that I think will never be broken. And Alan Moss, who was his first deputy commissioner under two administrations, and like many people in this room, suffers from being an attorney. In fact, he's a graduate of this institution. It's great also to see Ed Wallace, another practicing attorney and former city council member, and Sally Goodgold, who's not a lawyer. She says, either sadly, she wishes she were a lawyer. Also joined by Brian Anderson. Brian is the Commissioner of the Department of Records and Information Services, and also by avocation, sort of the city's unofficial historian. If you want to know which boat your grandparents came over through and whether they went through Ellis Island or through Battery Park, through the Castle Garden, he'll tell you. Not right away, but he could figure it out. So it's great to see Commissioner Anderson here, and so many other friends of parks. And I want to thank my staff who showed up. This is the earliest I've ever seen them in one place. It's very nice to see you. I'm here really just sort of to be the messenger of good news on behalf of Mayor Bloomberg, who, as it has turned out, is probably the best mayor the Parks Department has ever had, probably going back to the 1930s. And occasionally you'll hear me make reference to that because there are several golden ages of parks and park construction, and we happen to be in one now very quietly, and you'll see a bit of that right now. We don't have the federal government ponying up money the way they did during the Depression in the WPA. But we have, in fact, gotten some money from the federal government, particularly here in Lower Manhattan. But what we mostly have is a very generous capital budget right now, sort of defying expectations, mostly courtesy of Mayor Bloomberg. This year alone, there's $900 million allocated in the capital budget to build and expand parks. Next year, $600 million, so $1.5 billion in the budget over 2 years. I'm not sure how we'll spend that much money, because we've never had that much money to spend. It's actually difficult to spend it, but we'll do our best. We obviously won't spend it in the next 2 years. But a portion of that is being spent here in Lower Manhattan, and I feel grateful to be here in parks at a time when there's a mayor who really gets parks. And previous mayors were not hostile to parks, but they probably didn't celebrate them as much as this mayor does or put money into them. We have, in New York City, there's a sort of interesting and unique phenomenon, which is parks as public gathering spaces in a very major way. They are the village green, but they're also a secular church or cathedral, and they're places where people go in good times and bad to gather with each other, but also to seek solace in nature. And that was never more so than after 9/11. And then I mean immediately after 9/11, that very afternoon or the very next day, everybody went to their parks while there were still big plumes of smoke coming from down here in Lower Manhattan. People went out to their parks. And they came to come together and to sort of, I thought, to find reassurance in the fact that the parks were still there. And I remember very vividly the next afternoon, people gathering on the Sheep Meadow in Central Park. And of course, everybody remembers that Union Square became the town green for people to get together and talk and debate about what had happened. And there were so many mementos and candles and things put out that we had to collect them on a regular basis. And then they got transferred to the city's archives, all the mementos that were left there. But it's not just in times of crisis that people come to parks. Most of us who live in New York City do not have backyards. We're lucky if we have a window that gets sunlight that you can grow some herbs in. But the parks are essential places for people to connect with each other, to convene with nature, and to establish connections, formal and informal. Of course, there were all the great events take place, but there are also where people just gather instinctively. For instance, Henry will remember after John Lennon was killed, everybody went to Central Park. Why did they go to Central Park, to the band shell? Lennon had never performed there. It's just that was the thing to do. And of course, later Yoko Ono created Strawberry Fields, working with Henry. Now, in the aftermath of 9/11, there was an understanding that the emotional security that parks provide for New Yorkers also was a clue to what to do to rebuild after 9/11, that there was an immediate need to bring life back to Lower Manhattan, to say there is a future here for residents, for workers, and for tourists, and to say that not only will we build back, we'll build back stronger and better than ever. And a Lower Manhattan open space vision plan was developed, which was an extensive array of projects to expand green space, improve waterfront access, and increase the extent of active recreation for the workers, for the tourists, but particularly to encourage a growing residential population. We currently have a portfolio of about $131 million in open space projects, and that includes funding from Mayor Bloomberg, but also from his predecessor, Mayor Giuliani, from the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, which is primarily federal funds, federal and state, additional funds from the federal and state governments, and also foundation and corporation money. The plans to date call for the creation or enhancement of more than 20 sites throughout this downtown area, and it has all been done with the leadership of and in partnership with the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation. And I want to thank the corporation, and particularly Stefan Pryor, who is currently running it, who has worked so closely with us to build these projects. In their commitment to improving the quality of life for residents and business owners and workers in Lower Manhattan, they immediately allocated almost $25 million to the Parks Department for some immediate action projects. That was combined with a $60 million project to rebuild the entire waterfront, as well as many of the ball fields and central features of East River Park, which stretches from near Cherry Street all the way up to 14th Street. And that's a project that was funded first by Mayor Giuliani at Henry Stern's urging, along with some very timely assistance from Tony Coles, who was senior advisor to Mayor Giuliani at the time. And it was a great sort of parting gift from the mayor. And then, of course, as things happen, the cost of the project doubled, and when we needed another $30 million, Mayor Bloomberg ponied it up. So we now have really a complete reconstruction of East River Park going on, and as you go by, if you drive on the FDR Drive, you can't help but notice giant piles of dirt and big pilings going in, and the entire waterfront has to be rebuilt because it was literally collapsing into the East River. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, Deputy Mayor Dan Doctoroff convened an interagency team which included the Parks Department, the New York City Department of Transportation, Economic Development Corporation, City Planning, and other agencies to come up with this comprehensive strategy for revitalizing Lower Manhattan. And the team met weekly to identify what we called immediate action items that could be undertaken to be catalysts for overall rebuilding project. Something that we understood that you could do park projects very quickly. You cannot very quickly build buildings. And we sort of made a vow that if they gave us this money, we'd have projects done within the year. The City Council and the Borough President also allocated some funding for key neighborhood parks, and some private partners came through. Goldman Sachs, a group of people known as the Friends of the British Memorial Garden, the National Football League, Deutsche Bank, all joined with us in various projects. So the parks, and a map will come up on the screen, which will help you identify. There it is. In the back, I know you can't see it, but I'll tell you what they are, and those of you who work and live down here will know what we'll be able to place on the map. The parks currently in the program include Wall Street, Coenties, Slip, and Old Slip, Bowling Green, the Battery, Hanover Square, Drumgoole Plaza, and then Tribeca Park, East River Park, Brooklyn Bridge Plaza, Baruch Park, Sarah D. Roosevelt Park, Lillian Wald Playground, Al Smith Playground, Washington Market Park, Canal Park, which, by the way, is being dedicated today, which you'll hear more about, Sophie Loeb Playgrounds, and Columbus Park, right behind the courthouses in Chinatown. And then there are many projects coming up in the future, including a complete overhaul of Peter Minuit Plaza in front of the Whitehall Ferry Station, and Duarte Square, as well as a new bikeway, great lawn, and playground at the Battery. We're obviously, our interest in many of these sites is to make as green as possible an area that was not designed with a lot of parkland. As everybody knows, Lower Manhattan got to start with the Dutch East India Company, who set up business here at the tip of Manhattan Island, and immediately set about creating ways to bring ships in and out. So the waterfront of New York was largely built for business for the last 300 or 400 years. And there wasn't a lot of attention paid to the need for open space, particularly in Lower Manhattan. And one of the signature elements, of course, is greenery, and you'll see much more about that. But in addition to that, there's an opportunity to have a commonality of design elements, and that's another emphasis of the Bloomberg administration, is high-end, high-quality design, no doubt due to the influence of Deputy Mayor Patty Harris, who was head of the Art Commission under Mayor Koch, and then worked for many years with Mayor Bloomberg in the private sector, and then many people would say she was the architect of his first campaign for mayor, and as his deputy mayor oversees, among other things, the Parks Department, and the Art Commission, and the Cultural Affairs Department, and is sort of the the discerning eye as to how the city could be much more beautiful. So you see, for example, signature elements in lighting and benches, and we have opportunities because some of the parks are historic, but some are brand new in areas dominated by very modern office buildings. So you could have some historic-looking parks, or you could use more modernistic elements and try to say, well, what does a park of the 21st century look like? What are some of those design elements? And we were able to work with the Downtown Alliance, who had come up with some very interesting lighting schemes, and also with DOT, which approved some new lighting elements. The bench there, by the way, that you see, is that there's also some new bench elements. The futuristic-looking one on the top left is actually from the 1964 World's Fair, so it was very modernistic 40 years ago. So now we'll take you through the sites. Let's start on Wall Street. Wall Street, of course, was where the wall was for the Dutch. It's what separated them from the Native Americans who were on the other side of the wall. And for many years, it was just a very wide street that got wider as it got toward the East River, and then was filled with motorcycle parking. It has been transformed now into a large and contemporary green space. We essentially closed off half of the street and joined it to the sidewalk and formed a promenade through the middle, lined with trees, lights, and it will eventually have a glass fountain, which was designed by George Vilanicus, and we're being very much challenged now to figure out how to build a glass fountain. So we hope to see that by the spring of 2006. In addition, here you can see the design. It has flowering trees, but we've captured about two-thirds of the street and created really the first new park in Lower Manhattan, perhaps in many years. It's, I think, one of its signature elements is the greenery, but also the fountain, which we have to give credit to Deutsche Bank, who made a very large donation to create the fountain, and they are patiently, I hope, waiting for its installation. It's by way of an informal memorial to a number of Deutsche Bank employees who were killed on 9/11. We also have decided to name this street. I learned many things from Henry Story, but one of them was not to name a park after a street. So people wanted to call this Wall Street Park. I said, you've got Wall Street, as Henry used to say. And we've named it Mannahatta Park for the Native Americans who were here before the Dutch came, and that was the name of their tribe. So we figured there aren't very many parks named for the people who originally lived here. This would be a good place to start. Speaking of history, Coenty Slip, as the name implies, many of the streets are named for the slips where boats used to slip in, which were filled in long ago. Coenty Slip was an informal open space that was sort of just designated by some barriers, and it was really substantially complete by the December of 2004. We created a new plaza space with beautiful granite plaza, greenery. There's going to be a wonderful modern sculpture going in by a local artist. I don't want to spoil the surprise, but it's going to be terrific when it goes in. Perhaps the most interesting thing that happened in the creation of this park was in the excavation. The construction company found, you can see here, two completely intact sections of wooden water pipe, first installed by the Manhattan Water Company around 1800, 1810 or thereabouts. That, of course, was a first attempt to provide drinking water for the residences in Lower Manhattan. What was striking here was that we found these two pipes joined together. It's the largest intact section ever found. And the problem with wooden water pipes, these were hollowed out trees, was that the trees that were planted in the streets, their root systems would reach down to the water supply and, of course, interrupt the water from going into the houses. The Manhattan Water Company eventually, of course, became the Chase Manhattan Bank, and the rest is history. But this failed attempt to create the water supply system, we found evidence, and we hope that the Department of Environmental Protection has claimed title to these pipes, and they're restoring them. They said it's part of the water supply system, but they are spending money to restore them, and they will go on display probably in one of the museums when they're done. But the sculpture, which is being funded by Goldman Sachs, will be It's in fabrication now and will be installed in mid-fall. Another old slip, which is right near the former 1st Precinct, and was a collaborative effort. This was a quick and simple project. It was really just an effort to take a space which was mostly hardscape with a few trees and add greenery. In every case, the signature element is making it greener. There isn't a lot of greenery in Lower Manhattan, and this was quickly transformed and replanted, and now is a nice little bosque of trees in which one can go and sit and find some escape from the noise and the other bustle. But it is actually a very nice place, and when you can go there and have lunch and then walk into the police museum, which is right next door. And this was particularly a very good collaboration with DOT. In many cases, the Department of Transportation would provide the hard edges for us and do the street paving and relocate the utilities, and we'd come in and just do the landscaping. So this was a good, quick, and dirty project. Speaking of quick and dirty, Drumgold Plaza, which is right next to Pace University across the street from City Hall, was really just a park in name only. It was a sheet of asphalt underneath the on-ramp to the Brooklyn Bridge. And this was the first project that we did, and perhaps the most dramatic transformation. As you can see, it was an inhospitable sheet of asphalt under an archway. We came up with a contemporary design with an S-shaped sort of path running through it, similar, I think, in some ways to what you're seeing now at Canal Park. But there it is, fully transformed. I think it was done in about 9 months. And it's gone from being a sort of terrible place that nobody wanted to go to really a wonderful garden-esque site. And it just goes to show that in a city like New York, particularly in Lower Manhattan, if you make any place nice, people will come and sit and use it. And students from Pace use it, and office workers come there. Just on the other side of the Brooklyn Bridge is what we call Brooklyn Bridge Plaza. Again, it is a rather inhospitable site, famous among bicyclists and skateboarders. The kids, I don't mean really bicyclists, but people who do stunt bike riding, they call it the Brooklyn Bridge Banks because it's quite banked over. And we decided that we weren't going to fight that particular city hall, and we made it to be an informal skate park and bicycling park with also additional plantings, but a very small artificial turf athletic field, a place to do Tai Chi, and some low-level areas intended for skateboarders so that when they come to the other parks and try to use the benches and fountains as skateboard areas, we can nicely chase them away and say, why don't you go over here? This is a place for you, and they are, in fact, using it. So that was, again, a nice transformation. The other big trick was to get out the hundreds of cars that were parked there on a regular basis, and we were able to do that. Not far from here is Tribeca Park. It's a park that, again, was a nice oasis of trees, but it was really just a hardscape. And there were people who lived in the building across the street, the Friends of Tribeca Park, and their president, Julie Matsumoto, who played a very important role in helping us design the park. And then Assemblymember Glick provided some extra funds to restore the sidewalks. Again, we went from a relatively hardscaped area to a much more greened-up park with some very elegant paving, with a paving pattern by our landscape architect, Emmanuel Thingay. And I should mention that most of these designs, in fact, all of them, as far as I know, except for one, were designed by Parks Department landscape architects. And that was another reason we were able to move so quickly. Again, it's filled with beautiful shrubs and euonymus, holly, and perennials. And it shows, I think, that even tiny spots next to busy streets become oases that people will use very heavily. Essentially, if you build it in New York, they will come, particularly if you keep it clean, and it will be kept clean. The city's oldest park is Bowling Green. It was first designated as a park in 1733 and improved with grass and trees and a wood fence, as they said at the time, for the beauty and ornament of the said street, as well as for the recreation and delight of the inhabitants of this city. And I believe there was a rental, 3 peppercorns at the time. Henry? 1 peppercorn. It has been a public park ever since, and it was restored. And this was the case where the fence is a landmark fence. It's a very old fence, and the design is quite historic. And we respected the historic integrity. We didn't try to modernize this park. In fact, it was really a historic recreation, addition of new sod and landscaping and plantings and hoof benches and an irrigation system. And look at that now. What a nice transformation. That, of course, must be a spring view, because there's nothing like the green of spring. It really pops out. I would bet that by August in this hot summer, it didn't look quite as good as that. But a great old historic green space here in Lower Manhattan with a fountain originally donated by George Delacourt in the middle. The largest project of all the projects in this current round is at the Battery. The Battery is a park which is now benefiting from a public-private partnership with the Battery Conservancy run by Wari Price. It's done a magnificent job raising both awareness and government funding and private funding to completely rebuild and redesign the park. And the largest of the projects so far is what they call the Battery Bosque project. I should mention that the Conservancy is chaired by Bill Rudin, who has been a great advocate for Lower Manhattan. And the park is obviously a very important park. It's full of tourists. It's where people get on the boats to go to Liberty and Ellis Island. It was the site of the first immigrant receiving center, where 8.5 million people passed through before the Ellis Island Immigration Center was opened. In fact, Castle Garden, which was the name of the fort-turned-immigration center, became a Yiddishism, a Kesselgarten, meaning a place of great confusion. It comes from Castle Garden, which is Castle Clinton. It also happens to have wonderful views, as Wari Price says, our 15,000-acre park, the harbor of New York. And one of the ideas was to make this a real destination park, not just a place to pass through to get to the boats, and not just a place to eat lunch, but a destination. And a world-renowned sort of master garden designer who's particularly good working with perennials and native plants, Piet Oudolf, who is from the Netherlands, was brought in. He collaborated with Saratoga Associates, a private landscape architecture firm. The project was led by Laura Starr, and it created 4 acres of gardens in a bosque of 140 existing London plane trees, planted 32,000 perennials, a serpentine designer configured benches, a kiosk, a soft surface, and a very unique fountain, a spiral fountain designed by Claire Weiss and Mark Yost with in-ground, do we see there's the fountain up there. The bosque was open this summer. It has utterly transformed this park. And in addition to the fountain, there are plans, the next plans are for a carousel, the city's first aquatic carousel, where you'll be able to ride on giant fish and porpoises and dolphins, and money's being raised, as well as these very elegant kiosks, the money from which will go, the proceeds from which, if there are any, will go to support the park. But the Battery Conservancy has been a wonderful partner here. They have more plans, including creating the equivalent of the Sheep Meadow, a big town green that will be able to hold 10,000 people for concerts, and ultimately to recreate Castle Clinton as a performance space with a magnificent glass structure that would stick out of it. And that's the irrepressible Wari Price is still working on raising money for that, but that's moving right along. We have the temporary disruption of the construction of the new 1 and 9 subway line station at South Ferry, but that will lead to the recreation of the park's central lawn. Over to the East River Park goes back to 1940. It was the last of the Moses-era big WPA constructions. And as I mentioned, thanks to the cleaner water of the harbors, the supports of the waterfront esplanade had been eaten away, and it was literally collapsing into the water. It was closed down more than 4 years ago when Mayor Giuliani was in office. He allocated the first amount of money and Mayor Bloomberg the second amount. And we have restored almost all of the ball fields, some with grass, some with synthetic turf. If you go by now, any evening, the park is alive with activity. There you can see some of the new soccer fields, a detail of George Vilanicus's wonderful design of a spray shower park with harbor seals, I believe. That water sprays in and around it. It's beautiful, and as well as lots of plantings and a combination of both natural grass fields and synthetic turf fields, which are very good for soccer. The soccer field at East 6th Street has been fully restored. And now we're working on the waterfront, as I mentioned, a $60 million project. Essentially what we will have is almost a complete rebuilding of East River Park, which is really the most important recreational amenity in all of Lower Manhattan. It's full of ball fields and running tracks, and it's the only place where you can have, other than the small fields over here at Battery Park City, you can have Little League and other ball games. Just a short distance from here, behind the courthouses, is Columbus Park. Columbus Park, originally known as Mulberry Bend Park. It was part of the notorious Five Points area, and perhaps per capita one of our busiest parks in the system. If you go there any day of the week, fair weather or foul, it's filled with people, a lot of mahjong games going on, men bring out birds in cages, court officers play softball on what used to be the asphalt fields there. And it was also a significant community space after the attacks of 9/11. And there are three separate capital projects happening at this place. One was we had a donation. This was perhaps the most interesting story. A handyman in Minneapolis died with no heirs and left instructions for his lawyer to give the $1.3 million that he had saved up to the city of New York in the aftermath of 9/11. And most of that went to creating a new synthetic turf ball field on what was once a concrete lot. In the park. It's the white area to the left in that illustration. Luckily, this new technology allows us to take asphalt yards and create the equivalent of a grass field, but made out of plastic using recycled rubber and obviating the needs for chemicals and pesticides. But in addition to that, if we could go back, Jane, just one quick second. My Chief of Staff, Jane Rudolph, is operating the images, and I want to thank her. This green area at the north end of the park was completely redesigned. It was mostly hardscape by Wee May Grove. Wee May was a very talented landscape designer who unfortunately has just retired. She came in the 1970s, was brought in by Bronson Binger, and was one of our most talented landscape designers. And this is her last design. And I think appropriate that it was done in Chinatown, and perhaps her most beautiful design. It's created a beautiful garden-esque setting in what used to be just asphalt, and she used, if we go to the next image, large boulders and a very delicate bamboo-like fencing, and in fact groves of bamboo to create this beautiful garden-esque setting. She was assisted by Bill Gotthelf and George Bloomer. It's a $3 million project which celebrates an Asian-style garden. In addition, the pavilion, which you cannot see, one of the sort of few remaining pavilions from the City Beautiful movement that were put in parks in the teens and 20s of the last century, is being fully restored, again with money from the LMDC, from a federal grant from the City Council and the Borough President, which will have a new multi-purpose activity space and restrooms and barrier-free accessibility. And that construction work is also underway. So, in essence, the Columbus Park, perhaps one of our busiest parks, will be completely rebuilt in every aspect. And we were even able to take away a piece of a street to add to the park. Another lesson I learned from Henry: always make the park bigger if you can. We've made it a little bit bigger. Lillian Wald Playground was the sort of most embarrassing park of all in Manhattan. When I was a Manhattan Borough Commissioner, they used to tell me, this park has been closed for 20 years. I'd say, why? They say, well, it's just literally falling in. It was caving into the old tenements that were demolished underneath it. And the local elected officials never wanted to allocate the money to fix it up until finally they did, and I believe it was Catherine Freed, who was council member, just as she was leaving office, she finally allocated the money. It's located between Montgomery and Gouverneur Streets on the Lower East Side, and it was a park that had been closed, fenced off and closed because it was just so dangerous physically. And there you can see what it looked like for about 20 years. And finally the money was allocated. It's been completely redesigned as a sort of recreational park with handball courts and basketball courts, exercise facilities, volleyball court, picnic tables, and it's being used as the outdoor gymnasium for the neighboring high school. And they use it, look at that transformation. So a wonderful new recreational amenity in the middle of the public housing projects and adjacent to a street. This afternoon, we will celebrate the grand reopening of Canal Park. This is a park with a great story. I won't go into much detail. You can read about it in today's New York Times. I think it's page B7 or so. A good article by Timothy Williams, which tells the interesting story of the park that disappeared for 8 decades. It was taken over for the building of the tunnel as a work staging site, and then in 1930, when the work was done, instead of giving it back to the Parks Department, it was turned over to the Manhattan Borough President at the time, and then ended up being a parking lot for sanitation trucks. And thanks to a lot of community advocacy by the Canal West Coalition and neighbors across the street who did a lot of research, they realized that the park had in fact been illegally handed over in a violation of the public trust doctrine. They sued the city and the state of New York. I think the city and the state of New York were happy to lose that lawsuit, and it was settled. And the State Department of Transportation allocated close to $3 million to rebuild the park that was originally designed by Calvert Vaux and Samuel Parsons Jr. in the 1880s. It was a wonderful little park, sort of a mini Central Park, an area that had been an open space since the 1600s. And it's been beautifully redesigned in the style of Parsons and Vaux by parks designer Alan Scholl, and it has been doubled in size. And this is a project that dates back to Henry's administration, and he fought to make sure that the street was closed here, so the park was extended to this eastern tip here. And it will open today. It's an enormously complicated project. It's full of utilities underneath. There's a tide gate for DEP sewers and things. But it's we'd call it a new park, except it was there 80 years ago, but it's a renewed park. So it's a happy story of getting back a park that had disappeared. That doesn't happen very often. So that concludes, there it is, that concludes our tour of Lower Manhattan parks. I should tell you that there's a lot more to come. The LMDC has funded another $20 million worth of work to be done in Lower Manhattan. And Mayor Bloomberg recently announced a $150 million remake of the Lower East Side waterfront from the Battery all the way up to East River Park. That will include a creation of a number of new parks and playgrounds and a whole new waterfront esplanade. So as exciting as it's been so far, in some ways the best is yet to come. So we should all get ready for round 2. We hope to redo a number of parks and malls, the Pike and Allen Street malls, and a number of other projects that might be able to get done. So what you have seen is really the mid stages of a commitment to redo Lower Manhattan as public spaces in an unprecedented way in its entire history. And I thank you for coming today, and be happy to take a few questions.
We have a microphone in the center. Is that just the one microphone? Yes, please go to the microphone so everyone can hear the questions. And we invite as many people as like to come up and ask questions or short comments.
Good morning. Commissioner, I'm Paul J.Q. Lee. I live and work in Chinatown. I think we've worked together on a couple of things. The Children's Park under Commissioner Henry Stern's administration. If you'd allow me to share with you, for Chinatown, we want to credit Danny Mercado, some of your staff, Elaine Crowley, Bob Redmond, for all the fantastic work they've done. I did also want to mention the Joseph Temexco gift, the gentleman from Minneapolis. It was stated as a gift for healing for all of us New Yorkers after 9/11. And I thank you and Mayor Bloomberg for picking Columbus Park to apply that gift to. Just one question briefly. James Madison Park is a park that the community fought very hard for, where we were growing parked cars for many, many years. I didn't see that on your list, and if you could comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
I think we're hoping to do that in the next phase. It's certainly on our plans to do. It's a park that has been used for too long for parking, and though park and parking have the same sort of word as a route, they tend not to go too well together. So our hope is we in fact have some preliminary designs for doing that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
My name is Bernie Kabeck. If I may, before asking a question, I'd just like to add a footnote about Mannahatta Park. If you go to the end of the park where Wall Street narrows, you'll see there are two buildings there. One is rather modest size, the other much larger, which was built shortly afterwards. And what happened there is that some keen-eyed lawyer noticed that although it was just an ordinary street, it was actually mapped as a park, and the zoning resolution allowed a building fronting on a park, extra FAR. So I'm very happy to see that the work of that lawyer was realized in actuality with the development of Mannahatta Park. And since you used a Yiddishism, I'll use one too. Wish you a mazel tov on that.
Thank you.
I'm wondering whether the very impressive work that you showed today gives fodder to people who criticize the city's parks policy as being somewhat elitist and focused on Manhattan.
I think people could say that, but they'd be wrong, because even if you take all of the money that's being spent down here, much of which was not in fact city money, it's money allocated just for Lower Manhattan, it can't be used elsewhere. We nonetheless are spending much more money in the Bronx and in Brooklyn on capital projects. We have $220 million to spend over the next 5 years, which is mitigation money for the building of a water filtration plant on our golf driving range in Van Cortlandt Park. Brooklyn Bridge Park is being built across the water. That's a $160 million project in Brooklyn. We're going to be creating the city's perhaps second largest park at Fresh Kills, the former landfill site. The plans have been announced for that. That's hundreds of millions of dollars will be spent there. I think the answer is that all neighborhoods deserve to have great parks, and I think that's the reason why so much money has been allocated. There's understanding, I think, by the mayor and by everybody in City Hall that it's not just an amenity, it's not just a nice thing in your corner, but it will drive the livability of the city, that good parks make good neighborhoods. All you have to do is look at what's happened at Union Square. The city made an investment there 20 years ago, closed the park down for 2 years, fixed it up, and it has become the hottest sort of commercial shopping area in the entire city. And it's, if anything, it's so busy as a park, it's too busy. And now we're doing the final stages of rebuilding Union Square. So, in fact, there is, if you look at our capital budget, there is as much being spent in the Bronx and Brooklyn or more than is being spent in Manhattan over the next 5 years.
I just want to say that
I recognize that, man.
That everything that Adrian said was true, and it gives me enormous pleasure to recognize his achievements over the last 4 years, just as Rudy Giuliani, they've been America's mayor, Michael Bloomberg is Parks mayor, and deserves great credit.
Just 1 second, Harry.
You mentioned,
can people hear in the back? They can, okay.
You mentioned, one of the questioners mentioned James Madison Park. I just wanted to point out that I named that because it is bounded by St. James Place and Madison Street. And I guess that was taken to the utmost in the park we named for Senator Scoop Jackson, Henry M. Jackson of Washington State, conservative Democrat. That was bounded by Henry Street, Jackson Street, and Madison Street. You're doing fine, and just want to say. Anyway, you've done Manhattan, and you'll take your place. Great park names.
But I can't, all the good names have been taken. The other good name, well, he named many parks, but over in Brooklyn you can find Bush Clinton Park.
That's where those streets meet. And, in the Red Hook section, thoroughly run down, as you might imagine. But we will, maybe on the other corner of that intersection, you can have another Bush Clinton Park some years from now.
That's right.
Right. Anyway, you really are doing great, and it's a great credit to you and Patty Harris and the mayor. And one of the nice things about retiring after 15 years as Parks Commissioner is the knowledge that your agency is really in good hands. And I truly feel that way, and I think this presentation shows it.
Well,
Thank you.
I can say I was well trained.
Well trained. Thank you, Ross, for inviting Adrian.
I just want to make one comment. Henry's there. I believe it was 1988, and I was Commissioner of Transportation. Henry was Parks Commissioner, and in Transportation we had a deputy, David Gurin, who had an idea about taking streets that we had control over and giving them to Henry at Parks. And through conversations with Henry and myself, we created what was called Green Streets.
Yes, we did.
And the very first press conference for Green Streets was right out here on West Broadway and Leonard Street, a triangle which we had hoped to green up by taking over West Broadway. We still haven't done that. I bring it up in hopes that the new commissioner, Benepe, will think about taking over West Broadway and enlarging that into a park and continuing the work that we started in 1988.
That's right. You and I were Green Streets 1, but it was completed, really, and vastly expanded. Green Streets 2, we had 4 years in the Giuliani administration, but it did start under Mayor Ed Koch. Right?
Well, we'll try to do that one. As it turns out, Mayor Bloomberg, one of his biggest, one of the things he appreciates most are the Green Streets, and he told us to make sure to continue what Henry was doing. So we'll look at that as a Green Street. Sir.
My name is Bill Henning. I'm with Local 1180 of the Communications Workers. All this stuff about open space and greenery and the stuff that makes this a world-class city is very important. I wonder if you'd share with us your thoughts about using parklands for free speech areas, for political rallies. I know we've had a number of controversies over this in the last several years, and maybe you could share with us a little bit of your thoughts on that.
I think the parks, just like they serve as places for informal gatherings, also are places. They're the only places really for protests and for other First Amendment related activities. So every year we have about 500 or so protests or rallies, demonstrations, or other things covered loosely by the First Amendment. They will continue to be so. Union Square will continue to fill that function, and all the other parks. The thing that you don't want to do is have the tragedy of the commons, which is to say, come in and do your own thing, whatever it may be, no matter what the damage it would be on that commons. So if, for example, there was a lot of discussion when we said that we didn't want to host 250,000 people on the Great Lawn of Central Park because it was 3 times as many people as could safely fit. And we were sued twice over that, and twice won, because I think there was an understanding that as long as you can offer ample alternative means for expression, which we do, every time someone comes to us and says, I want to have an event, and it could be anything from a political demonstration to, say, Reverend Billy Graham wanted to have a crusade, and he first came to us and said, I'd like to have the Great Lawn in Central Park, which was what everybody would like to have, and we said, what you are asking for can't be accommodated in the Great Lawn. How would you like to go to Flushing Meadows Park, which is a fairgrounds and it's big, wide open spaces and can easily accommodate 80,000 people a night over 3 nights? And they came and looked at it and said, sure. And they did it, and it was the most difficult event we've ever put on in a park, because it was 3 days, 80,000 people a day that had mostly had to come in by mass transit. But it worked great, and the press was happy to travel to Queens. They found that, in fact, it was part of New York City. But there's a bit of a sort of myopia that if it's not in Central Park, it doesn't count. And Central Park can only take so much of a beating, and then it goes back to the way it used to be in the old days, which was a dust bowl. So our message is the parks are open and available for speech of all kinds, just in an appropriate time, place, and manner, and the courts have continuously backed us up in that.
Adrian, my name is Luther Harris, author of the book Around Washington Square. I'd appreciate it if you'd speak to the huge cut in maintenance budget for parks. New Yorkers for Parks says that your department is one of the worst of the major cities in the United States in terms of park maintenance because, presumably, of those budget cuts. I speak for Washington Square, which is a little north of these downtown squares you're talking about. Over the years, for example, what had been steps had asphalt poured over them rather than be fixed. Whole areas have had benches removed because there was no money to repair them. I'd like for you to speak to this dramatic drop in maintenance costs, maintenance budget that New Yorkers for Parks reported on, and what possibly you can do about it.
Well, I would speak to it, except it's not true. The budget has not been cut. It's been expanded. The capital budget has been expanded fourfold from its best year in the past. The expense budget has gone up from $200 million to $270 million. The number of park workers available to maintain the parks is probably at an all-time modern high. And the conditions of the parks, as measured by the world's sort of best and only formal sort of management indicator system, excuse me, for measuring the quality of parks, for putting a quantitative analysis of the quality of the parks, which is pioneered by Henry Stern. It's called the Park Inspection Program. Shows that the parks have never been cleaner or in better shape than they are now. The product of 20 years of capital investment, and we've been aided immeasurably by the allocation of federal welfare funds to hire up to 7,000 transitional workers a year to help us maintain the parks. Commissioner Moss, when he was deputy commissioner, created something called the requirements contracts, allowing us to do quick capital contracts for projects that don't require designs. And I would think that most New Yorkers know that their parks are now in much better shape than they were 20 years ago, both in the physical condition and in the area of maintenance. We're aided by 50 or 60,000 volunteers who are part of the Partnerships for Parks program, as well as dozens of groups ranging from big organizations like the Central Park Conservancy to small organizations like the groups that help Washington Square. So you could always do a better job. Our parks are not all the way we'd like them to be, but there's no question that they're in better shape, cleaner, and better managed by far than they were 25 years ago. So we still have work to do, and we always would like to have more money, but the mayor has modestly increased our full-time staff, and we have a major increase in overall staffing through various programs. At the height of the summer, we have about 10,000 people working in the Parks Department. So, yeah, it's Washington Square Park needs work. We luckily have millions of dollars allocated to fix it up, and we're going to move ahead with that project. The last time Ed Koch tried to do it, there was such disagreement at the community level, he decided that since everybody was so unhappy about the plans to fix up the park, he'd put the money where it would be more appreciated in another park. So it's our hope now to move ahead with all the money we have allocated to fix up the park and make it as good a park as all the other parks that have been restored around it, Madison Square and Tompkins Square and Union Square, City Hall Park. It's sort of the last of the lower Manhattan parks that hasn't had significant capital dollars put into it. And Henry was ready to do it with Mayor Koch, but there was such a disagreement at the local level that they said, who needs this object? So we'll spend the money where it's appreciated. But we are going to fix Washington Square too.
Could you tell us what the status of that plan is right now?
It was just our plan for the park. Was just reaffirmed in a vote by the community board last night. So we hope to move ahead with it in the spring.
My name is Vanessa Gruen from the Municipal Art Society.
Hi, Vanessa.
How are you?
A former colleague for my years at the Municipal Art Society.
I have a question about the recent historic rezoning of the Greenpoint Williamsburg area, which now will enable us to have 1.7 miles of waterfront along the East River. And in the rezoning, the developer is required to prepare or to create the esplanade in front of their development. But eventually, it's hoped that this will all be turned over to the Parks Department so that the Parks Department will maintain it. Could you say anything about how the Parks Department intends to get control of this land, or if is that in the planning stages? Is there at any stage at all?
Yeah, it's the land that will be created as part of the rezoning is not required to be parkland, but we are working toward making sure that it becomes parkland. We want to sort of make it such that the developers will want to have it be parkland, and they have to maintain it anyway, and they have to maintain it as open public space. They might as well give it to us or to an entity created, a special purpose entity, to maintain it rather than having it done piecemeal. Jennifer Hoppe, who's our Deputy Director of Planning, is here, and she's been working along with Joshua Laird on that project. We're working very closely with city planning on coming up with common design elements for the waterfront. We'll be working with the Municipal Art Society, who's doing work in the community to solicit opinions as to what those waterfront esplanades and parks should look like. But we believe that we will end up having control of those waterfront esplanades that will be created in Greenpoint, and we're working toward that end. Jennifer, is anything more specific than that? She says that covers the waterfront.
This is the last question.
It's actually a related question. I'm Vicki Bean from the Furman Center on Real Estate and Urban Policy. And I wondered, several weeks ago, Peter Harnack from the Trust for Public Land proposed the use of impact fees on developers of either residential housing or office space that would create money rather than just a commitment to open space, but would create money for the Parks Department to provide the kind of parks that are necessary when you have increased residential development or increased office development. And I wondered what your position was on that, and more broadly, what kinds of creative financing mechanisms is the department thinking about to take us forward into the next generation when we're not necessarily assured of favorable mayors and otherwise?
It's an interesting question. I'll state on the record, the Parks Department is always interested in having more money. Let me not just the fact that we might have a hard time spending our capital dollars doesn't mean we don't want them. It just means we have to hire more people and more consultants a lot more quickly. And that goes double for the expense budget. We would never turn down more money, and any kind of creative financing mechanisms are attractive to us. Over the years, many things have been proposed, and other things have been done. For example, when zoning bonuses have been created, or the zoning otherwise changed, or people allowed to build things where they normally wouldn't be allowed to build, say over a highway on the FDR Drive. One of the things that's been done is that funds have been created to mitigate for that and deposited with the Parks Department. So for example, all of the maintenance of the parkland along the FDR Drive is done through a multi-million-dollar account that was set up many years ago by the various developers, is now held in trust by the city, and the interest of that account is used to hire the staff and buy the materials for maintaining that. The other obvious example, it would be Bryant Park, where there's a business improvement district created for the sole purpose of improving the park. And the city levies an additional tax, which it collects and turns over to the Bryant Park Restoration Corporation, which then spends it on the park. And the park is so well financially endowed, they sort of have a hard time figuring out how to spend the money. I mean, there's more money than you can think of for a park like that. The issue, I think, would be if you simply imposed an additional surcharge on building any building, even if it's as of right, would that have a chilling effect, let's say, not in a superheated economy, but in a sort of normal economy? Right now, people are desperate to build on every corner of the city. That wasn't always the case, and it surely won't be the case forever. There are cycles in these things. Andy Manchel, who's in the back, was exploring the idea of what they call a park improvement district. Say a place like Riverside Drive the idea would be, shouldn't all the people who benefit from being across from Riverside Park pay into a fund, just like a business improvement district, but in a residential area that would improve the park? It's a nice idea in principle. It runs into difficulties when you go from a rental building to a co-op building. It's difficult, if not impossible, for the owner of a rental building to pass on the assessment to the tenants. It's not legal. That can be done by a co-op building, but not so by a rental building. There isn't a lot of enthusiasm for it among some of the property owners. The other thing that it does is people talk about a two-tiered park system. If the only parks that get additional money are those that have wealthy real estate across the street, is that good? I think better, perhaps, to do what Chicago has, which is to have a park district for the city, where there's a small additional assessment on all the real estate to create a permanent fund that cannot be cut. To make, if you say all of the parks help make good neighborhoods and increase real estate values, should people who own property pay a small additional tax each year to ensure that those parks stay maintained? That's what's done in Chicago. It works well for Chicago, but it's not a panacea, because even though they have a relatively large budget per capita compared to ours, I was there visiting with the head of the Chicago Park District, and he complained that his capital budget is a very small figure compared to ours. And he said he's expected to pay all of his pension costs and interest on the bonds for his capital budget out of the money that comes from the Park District. So in fact, what sounds like a lot of money becomes a lot less money if you have to spend half of it just on paying debt service. So there are good sides and bad sides, but let's put it this way. We, as the Parks Department, are always interested in having more money. What the Finance Department or OMB or the homeowners would think of that as a different story.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, this time is up. I want to thank Adrian Benepe for a really quite sophisticated and wonderful talk about parks. One of the things that I got out of this morning is just how sophisticated it is to run the Parks Department and how important it is to have the political, financial, as well as the skills that you would think about as related to parks. So we're delighted to have this morning to think about that and to learn so much about the parks. I wanted, as we always do, to give to our speakers a product of the scholarship of this law school. This is a book by my colleague David Schoenbrod, Saving Our Environment from Washington. He's not talking about the money side of things. And I present it to you with the thanks of New York Law School for a wonderful morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank Jennifer Hoppe from our planning division and Jane Rudolph, who put together this wonderful slideshow with us. Jennifer also has been helping lead the efforts on planning the Lower Manhattan. I want to thank our whole Capitol team and our Deputy Commissioner, Amy Freitag, who really worked hard to get these first projects done. And Joanne Imoheisen and her staff from our Revenue Division, who are busy bringing in money to go to the city's general fund and pay for all the other city services. Joanne is right here.